Good morning. Welcome to the press conference with Senator Kim Pate. Bon matin, bienvenue à la conférence de presse avec la sénatrice Kim Pate. Senator, go ahead.
Thank you very much. The unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I'm joined today by Alex Neve, who many of you will already know, a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, who's joining me in a humanitarian delegation that intends to travel to northeast Syria in August. We're also joined by Sally Lane, mother of Jack Letts, who is the longest-serving Canadian detainee in northeast Syria, and Matthew Behrens, an Ottawa-based human rights advocate who has worked tirelessly to address these very serious human rights concerns. While I appear here today as a senator, I've spent, as many of you know, more than 40 years working in and around the legal and penal systems of Canada, with and on behalf of some of the most marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized people in the country. I've also visited prisons in many other parts of the world. In my work with women, men, and youth who have been physically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually devastated by imprisonment, I have always been inspired by the tenacity of those who push for their freedom and for the basic rights of prisoners to be fully protected. I have been gravely disappointed in the lack of systemic changes that are so desperately needed to uphold justice and avoid injustice, particularly in this country. It is in that context that this humanitarian mission with Alex Neve which Alex Neve will describe in more detail, speaks very directly to me. To have learned that Canadian citizens, men, women, and children have been arbitrarily detained for years under the most appalling conditions when their own government appears to hold the key to their return is quite simply astounding. I represent the Chamber of Sober Second Thought in the Senate of Canada. Sadly, it would appear that very little sober second thought has gone into the policies which govern our government's response to the plight of Canadians detained and abandoned in northeast Syria. Policies which, quite frankly, have been intent on blocking resolution of this grave situation. It's policies which have deepened the human rights violations that are occurring. And when I hear talk and reference to still children who are reportedly eating sand because they are so nutritionally deficient, about women who were trafficked into the region, even by assets of their own intelligence agency, and about scores of men who are crammed into airless, sunless dungeons designed only to hold a few individuals, I am reminded far too viscerally of the impact that has on people neurologically, physiologically, psychologically, and of course, sometimes irreparably, permanently. Some of my as yet unanswered questions include, why did Canada change its position 5 years ago of seemingly being committed to repatriation, to fighting tooth and nail against repatriation? Why are family members like Sally left in the dark by the Canadian government, suffering the psychological torment herself of not knowing if her son is all right, other mothers not knowing if their sons, daughters, and grandchildren are even alive, and having no idea when that nightmare will end? And yesterday we reflected on this in terms of the state for First Nations and Inuit and Métis families as we talked about the legacy of colonization and genocide for Indigenous peoples. This is a similar form of torture, of not knowing where your children are, whether they're even alive still. Why is Canada ignoring the recommendations of independent United Nations human rights experts, globally respected international human rights and humanitarian organization, its own House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, and many other experts around the world, all of whom have called for repatriation as the only legally compliant response? In my years of negotiating in prisons in Canada and with correctional bureaucrats, I have often come up against very high and seemingly impenetrable walls, but it has always been clear to me that no situation is unsolvable. I've also been continually impressed that it is often through organizations like the ones that are speaking out and the individuals here today that interventions of civil society, and particularly in this context, a humanitarian delegation, could advance some of the most creative and effective solutions against outwardly impossible odds. So I have great hope that our combined efforts will open the dialogue necessary to end this situation. I'm ready to meet with, and in fact, we have now scheduled a call with the Kurdish administration. I'm happy to meet with Canadian officials and very much want to assist where I can to try to break the impasse that has led us to this point and to resolve the crisis in a humanitarian manner that respects human rights and ends the unspeakable suffering that has gone on for far too many, for far too long. Now, Alex, if you'd like to add, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pate, and bonjour tout le monde. The plight of tens of thousands of men, women, and children, thousands of whom are foreign nationals, held in detention centers and camps in northeast Syria, is a full-blown human rights and security crisis. There's no other way to describe it. That is clear from the conclusions of UN human rights experts, from reports issued by international human rights and humanitarian groups, such as Human Rights Watch, Save the Children. The International Committee of the Red Cross is concerned. It is clear from the numerous urgent pleas from the Syrian Kurdish administration that governs the region and from the US government for foreign governments such as Canada to bring their nationals home. Canada's inexplicable policy over the past 5 years has been to ignore the pleas from the Syrian Kurdish administration, avoid our human rights responsibilities, and abandon dozens of Canadians, more than half of them children, to grave human rights violations. Instead, the government has actively worked to obstruct and delay repatriation, well evidenced, for instance, in aggressive positions taken in court proceedings. While a significant number of Canadians, all of them women and children, have recently been brought home, other Canadians remain in northeast Syria, including 4 imprisoned men. Our delegation seeks to fill this gap. As Senator Pate has described, we plan to travel to northeast Syria for several days at the end of August. Members of the delegation include Senator Pate, myself, retired Canadian ambassador and former director of foreign intelligence with Global Affairs, Scott Hetherington, and we expect 1 or 2 other Canadian human rights lawyers to join us as well. We first wrote to the government about this in April, offering to play the role of serving as their designated or delegated representative in facilitating and arranging the release and repatriation of Canadians still held in northeast Syria. Dealing with a designated representative is something that the Syrian Kurdish administration has indicated would be acceptable as part of the repatriation process. We were, at that time, prepared to travel at the end of May. That offer was declined by the Canadian government. It is now our intention to carry out a humanitarian visit to the region, which we hope will include an opportunity to have access to the camps and detention centers, to meet with the Canadians who are held there, and to get a first-hand assessment of their welfare, their health, and well-being. We are seeking meetings as well with local officials. As Senator Pate indicated, we are in contact with the Syrian Kurdish administration and are having conversations to make the necessary arrangements. We are prepared to play whatever role we can in working towards resolution of this protracted situation, including, ultimately, the release and repatriation of Canadians still detained. We remain open to being tasked by the Canadian government to be their designated representative in those discussions. A wide range of human rights are at stake through this current policy of leaving men, women, and children to languish in prisons and camps, not charged, not brought to trial, enduring very difficult prison and camp conditions. If there is any credible evidence that any of these individuals are responsible for crimes, including involvement in terrorism, unlawful arbitrary detention does nothing to ensure accountability. The current strategy not only imperils human rights, it perpetuates insecurity. The proper course of action would be to pursue justice. here in Canada through our own legal system. The answer to all of this continues to lie in the Canadian government's hands. Repatriate all Canadians remaining in northeast Syria now, including non-Canadian mothers of Canadian children. That is what human rights, justice, and security all require. I think I'm going to turn over to Matthew now.
Thank you, Alex and Senator Pate. We're here today also to seek the cooperation of the Canadian government in ending an impasse of its own making. Over the past several years, Canada has led a commendable global initiative against arbitrary detention. Yet its own policies and actions over the past decade, especially with respect to the Canadian Muslim men, women, and children illegally held in northeast Syria, have consigned them to precisely that: arbitrary detention, seemingly without end. And rather than work diligently to end this global human rights concern, the Canadian government has deployed its lawyers in court in recent months seeking to block the return of the 4 Canadian men in northeast Syria whose conditions were described by federal court Justice Brown as dire. These Canadian citizens have been abandoned to a legal black hole of detention without charge or trial, beyond the reach of human rights protections, legal counsel, and family. It's akin to Guantanamo Bay. As has been mentioned earlier, the Syrian Kurdish administration officials who are allied to Canada have repeatedly told Ottawa, "We will hand over your citizens if you write us a letter, issue travel documents, and send an official representative or a delegate from a humanitarian organization to receive them." Canada's U.S. military ally has escorts prepared to bring them out of the region, and indeed has done so twice over the past 6 months. Canada has, rightly and importantly, invested $2.9 million to repatriate Iraqi nationals from these camps and prisons, yet it has spent untold amounts in court to prevent the return of these 4 citizens, even as it has repatriated most of the women and children who were part of the original legal case. As has been mentioned, Canada was one of the first nations to speak with Syrian Kurdish administration officials about repatriation, but all of that ended in 2018, and ever since, the policy of this government has been to block all reasonable efforts to end what is clearly a human rights crisis. As a result, today we are announcing this civic initiative designed to address this concern and move towards bringing an end to years of human rights abuse. This humanitarian delegation, as Mr. Neve pointed out, will be traveling to the region in August. First and foremost, to access and meet with any Canadians who remain held in the prison camps or detention centers, as well as the non-Canadian mothers of Canadian children. The delegation is ready and willing to meet with local officials of the Syrian Kurdish administration to discuss the steps that will lead to the release and repatriation of these Canadians. And the delegation hopes, as you have heard, to work with the Canadian government as well in whatever capacity would assist in upholding human rights and bringing these Canadians home. And as you learn more about the delegation's initial plans today, we would like to put forward a very specific challenge to the Canadian government. Ottawa, the Canadian government, has made it clear that they are not prepared to repatriate these 4 detained Canadian men from conditions that the United Nations has described as akin to torture. The question for the Canadian government is this: will you nonetheless cooperate with this humanitarian delegation in a manner that finally achieves that end? It is time to end the obstruction and move towards solutions. In December of 2022, Justice Brown of the Federal Court declared Canadians are dying or at risk of dying every day that this matter is adjourned. 7 months later, those lives are still on the line, and the Canadian government, through its conscious decisions, has failed to address that grave concern. In good conscience, we simply cannot allow that to happen. I'm going to turn it over to Sally Lane, whose son just marked 6 years and 1 month of arbitrary detention, the longest held detainee in northeast Syria.
Thank you, Matthew. My son Jack, a Canadian citizen, has been detained in a prison in northeast Syria for more than 6 years. He's being held incommunicado with not even basic human rights, crammed into a cell with 40 other detainees, but only 8 beds. He lacks adequate food, water, and hygiene, and has no medical treatment. The last report I received about him from 4 years ago stated he was rarely allowed outside for fresh air. Red Cross visits to check on the health of male detainees have been forbidden since the Hasakeh prison riots in January 2022, in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. The last time I heard Jack's voice was July 8, 2017. In January 2018, Global Affairs Canada told me that they were doing everything they could to secure the release of my son. However, this was a lie. Global Affairs has in fact put obstacle after obstacle in the way of families who are trying to rescue their children from inhumane prisons and camps. Although I live 10 minutes away from the Global Affairs office, they've refused to even grant me a meeting to discuss how I can extricate my son from his situation of severe human rights abuse. In January of this year, our families won a victory in the courts after the judge found that Canada had breached international humanitarian law and its own Charter of Rights and Freedoms by refusing to allow our male relatives to come home. We were elated to think that we would finally see Jack again and that his long, painful ordeal would finally be over. Our hopes were then crushed when appeal court judge David Stratus agreed with the government that the UN evidence of torture and inhumane treatment in the prisons was irrelevant, that it was not for him, a judge, to decide on a moral issue, and that the government has no legal obligation to bring my son home. The question to my mind is, why doesn't the government want to rescue its citizens from torture conditions? Why did it announce its leadership of a global campaign against arbitrary detention in February 2021, yet exempt its own citizens from this human rights campaign? Why is Canada supporting a system of cradle-to-grave detention in which young boys are taken from their mothers in the camps at the age of 10 and incarcerated in unknown detention centres, a system described by Human Rights Watch as enforced disappearance and a crime against humanity? Families have repeatedly said that they are willing for their detained relatives to face whatever justice awaits them in their home countries. I believe Jack is innocent, and I've been told by the British police that they have found no evidence of any wrongdoing on his part. It is inconceivable to me that Canada considers itself to be a country governed by the rule of law, yet insists on its citizens being detained indefinitely on no charge in a foreign land. In the face of government intransigence, negligence, and inaction, we feel that our own delegation to northeast Syria is the only option to put an end once and for all to the current shameful political stalemate. The Kurdish authorities have repeatedly emphasized over many years that repatriation remains their preferred option. The US State Department reinforced this position just 2 weeks ago, with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken announcing on the visit to the region that repatriation is the only durable solution to this crisis. The UN has stated it is the only law-compliant option. It is the only decent, humane, and right thing to do. It is time to bring Jack and the other Canadians home.
Thank you. We'll now start the question period. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période de questions. As a reminder, one question, one follow-up. Comme un petit rappel, une question de suivi. We'll start with Ashley Burke, CBC.
Thank you. My first question is, what assurances, if any, have you been given from ANZ about what access you could get if you could physically go see any of the 4 Canadians that you believe are there? What have they told you?
We're just commencing those discussions. As Senator Pate indicated, we have a call with ANZ officials coming up. And obviously those are the exact questions that we'll be working through. So we don't yet know. We're confident. We're coming in a very constructive spirit, a delegation that its entire focus is on helping to facilitate solutions that the administration itself also seeks. So we're looking forward to cooperation and collaboration and hopefully to having full access.
Did you ever consider going, and if so, why did you change your mind?
Yes, I was fully prepared to go on the delegation in May when it was planned to be a delegation that was authorized by the government. We didn't receive authorization, and so we've changed the nature of our delegation, so it is now more a diplomatic and humanitarian trip. And I think that it would be too emotionally difficult for me to travel there with a diplomatic mission, knowing that Jack is not coming back with me. And I think it would devastate him as well. But I have confidence in a delegation led by Senator Pate and Alex Neve that they will have fruitful discussions with the Kurdish administration, because this is what the Kurdish administration has been seeking for a long time, and it's what families have been seeking for a very long time now.
Thank you. Next question, Judy Trent from CTV.
Senator Pate, I was wondering if you could give me a sense of where you think the obstruction is coming from. You mentioned, we've heard several times that in 2018, prior to that the government seemed open to repatriation, and then there was a sudden reverse in terms of their stance. In terms of, the people you've spoken to in government, do you have an idea of where that reversal is coming from?
I do not. I wish I did. We have reached out to Minister Joly. They've indicated that it's their job to work on the repatriation, hence the reason that we've pivoted to a humanitarian delegation. And quite frankly, I'm concerned that this is very similar to the sorts of stonewalling I received often when I was trying to get into prisons before I had the right of access that I currently have, hence the reason I'm assisting in this process. And Alex Neve has been involved in this kind of work for far longer than I have. I'm now a novice coming into this, but so I think I could defer to you as to what insights you have as to why the Canadian government is not responding.
I mean, I would also echo what Senator Pate has said, that we don't have an answer to that question, and I think that in itself is an indictment, because we should have an answer to that question. We should know why the policy has changed so dramatically. There should be clarity and transparency. I think it's impossible to avoid the conclusion that there's political implications here, that the government is concerned about being accused, perhaps by the Conservative Party and others, of being soft on terror, about being inattentive to security issues. We've seen that so many times in the past when these kinds of situations where national security and human rights issues are in the frame at the same time, and human rights get left to the side because of that concern. One would have liked to think that lessons have been learned in Canada from past cases like Meher Arar and Omar Khadr, the cases that were examined in the Yakabuchi inquiry, and so many others. But it does seem to be a bit of the same old in that regard. But I think Sally or Matthew may also be able to add a little bit of their sense of what was happening in and around 2018 in particular.
Yeah, in 2018, Jack was actually part of a group of Canadians who were due to be brought back. In fact, we were told by by the Kurdish administration themselves and by a British MP who had gone on a prior delegation, that repatriation was actually 1 week away. And all the information that I was getting from Global Affairs up until that point had been very positive. That's when they were saying that they were making every effort to bring Jack home, that they took human rights abuses very seriously. Trudeau himself, in Hamilton Town Hall meeting, said that he had full confidence in Canada's security services, and that we had to be prepared for people to come back. The RCMP said the same thing. And then everything was called off. Nobody knew why. Journalists haven't been able to get to the bottom of it. The Kurds themselves are asking the Canadian government, everything went quiet, what happened? Since then, I have received the same paragraph from Global Affairs Canada that there's nothing they can do, it's too dangerous, it's one excuse after another, it's too dangerous. Part of this delegation is proving that it can be done, that our delegation is willing to take the risk that the government is not willing to take, which is their job. It is the job of the Foreign Ministry to protect Canadians abroad who are in abusive conditions.
The federal government won its appeal, reversing Justice Brown's decision. So from that standpoint, it has a legal argument. I'd like to know, when you are countering that, what argument are you using? Is it just one based on a moral responsibility from this government, now that it does seem to have the legal right of not repatriating the Canadians?
I think we have to be clear about what that court ruling establishes and what it doesn't establish. So it does establish that, at least for the time being, we'll see if the Supreme Court has an opportunity to weigh in and perhaps reach different conclusions. But the only question there was, pursuant to Section 6 of the Charter, is the government obliged to take this action? And presently, pursuant to the Federal Court of Appeal ruling, they don't hold that obligation. That does not mean that they do not have responsibilities and shouldn't be considered to have responsibilities under international human rights obligations. Many of which are in play here because there are so many serious human rights concerns that are playing out on the ground in Syria. And regardless of what court ruling there has or has not been with respect to the Charter, those obligations matter. They apply at all times, and Canada should be looking for all possible avenues to fulfill those obligations and ensure that the rights of these Canadian citizens are protected. So we do think we're, yes, in answer to your question, we're on strong moral ground, but we do also consider that we're on strong legal ground, and that ground is international human rights.
I'd like to also point out that this has been a record year for repatriations from northeast Syria. In the first 2 months of 2023, more individuals were repatriated from the region than in all of 2022, and thousands more are expected to be repatriated this year. So what we have asked the Canadian government to do in the past, it's not like it's reinventing the wheel. It's been done time and time again. It's been done safely, and Canadian officials have done this on numerous occasions as well. So its obsession with these 4 men is quite disturbing, especially when, as the federal court found, the federal court justice specifically asked government lawyers, do you have any evidence that these men were fighters or that they were involved in violence? And the answer was no, we have no such evidence. So why are they still being held? And as Alex Neve said, this is part of an ongoing pattern in which Canadian, largely Muslim men who are overseas and detained are automatically assumed guilty. And as we've seen from judicial inquiries, federal court and Supreme Court decisions, Canada has been consistently wrong in almost all of those cases.
Thank you. Next question, Jim Brownskill from Canadian Press.
Good morning. Given the nature of the mission now, I'm wondering what are some of the concrete things you hope to achieve when you're overseas?
One hope to see the detainees and see the conditions and be able to actually try and address as best possible we can.
I mean, I think that is our overriding objective here, and that's why we are terming this now a humanitarian delegation. As you heard from Sally Lane with respect to her son, there's been no news, no access, no information about his well-being, or even specifically about his whereabouts for several years now. And similarly with respect to the plight of other Canadians as well. So there's just a fundamental piece of this mission that is to seek that access, to get that information, to be able to visit, in particular with prisoners, but also absolutely if Canadians remain in the camps at the time, we will seek that access as well. To see that they're okay, to see if they have particular needs which we could then perhaps be highlighting with Canadian officials that they should be playing an immediate role in fulfilling. And then we do have a wider objective of we seek to play whatever role we can in constructively moving towards solutions here. And as Sally Lane has reminded us, many experts, including the UN, have repeatedly said the only legally compliant solution here is repatriation. So through the discussions we intend and hope to have with local officials on the ground, we'll play whatever role we can in moving towards that outcome. And we repeat, as we've said many times, and as we made clear in our initial letter to the government in April, we are ready to play the role of being their designate, of being their delegate. The Syrian Kurdish administration have said that that is okay to them. They are fine with dealing with delegates and designated representatives from foreign governments. So that remains on the table as well.
And a question for Senator Pate. I'm wondering if you have spoken to the government representative in the Senate about this issue, Mark Gold, and what has he said, if so?
I haven't spoken to Mark Gold. I certainly have spoken to public safety and have received a briefing. I was asked to have a security briefing on this. I did have that. And I've also spoken to others who have experience in the overseas that I have not had. And as well as Mr. Hetherington about the potential ways that we could approach this that would be most constructive. So,
did that provide you any insights into what's the reasons that we've asked about today about why they will not endorse your delegation?
I'm sorry that I do not have that. I certainly was initially discouraged from even considering going. I then, of course, did my, obviously I would do my due diligence and determine whether there is a risk and if there is a risk. And, that will be an ongoing assessment throughout this process. If there is a risk, we will certainly have that assessed. And I will follow the lead of folks who on the ground know this area, who have done this work, in much the same way I would if I was taking people, as I have, into the prisons in this country, would certainly ascertain that it's not a risk to those going in. So my interest now is really in trying to do whatever I can to help open up the avenues and resume, if I could say, communication to ensure that some communication is occurring and that at the very least we have some idea of what the conditions are. Ideally, be able to alleviate those and bring folks home.
Thank you. People on Zoom, if you have a question, please raise hand function at this moment. Les gens sur Zoom, si vous avez des questions, vous utilisez votre fonction main levée maintenant. I believe we have one more question in the room from Ashley.
The latest court challenge, will you be taking it to the Supreme Court of Canada to challenge it?
Well, it's not our case, so that's probably...
Yes, is the answer to that. We've already filed the leave for appeal, and we're asking for an expedited hearing, given the urgent nature of this and that people's lives are at risk.
And I'm also hoping to know if you're not a delegate, has Anne's given you any indication that at some point you could help? You could broker some sort of deal to repatriate them, or is that completely off the table when you go as well?
We don't have any clear indication as to what Anne's position on that will be. I think from our perspective, we want to keep everything on the table. We want to keep everything on the table with ANZ. We want to keep everything on the table with the Canadian government as well. Any role we can play to help move towards that legally compliant solution of repatriation, we're prepared to do.
Is there any evidence that any other countries, citizens from any other countries have been repatriated from those camps if they didn't have their government support?
In fact, a Canadian citizen was brought here by a U.S. diplomat several years ago by the name of Peter Galbraith. So he was able to get in there and bring somebody out. And so we see no reason why we cannot replicate that.
He was considered Canada's delegate.
No, he's an American diplomat, and he was not delegated by the government of Canada. And in fact, when Kimberly Pullman and 3 other individuals were brought back last fall, Mr. Galbraith tweeted they could have been brought back 7 months earlier. He was prepared to bring them out, but he was blocked by the Canadian government. So not only did he not have the permission of the Canadian government to do that, the Canadian government interceded and prevented a woman who the United Nations had said needed urgent medical care from getting that urgent medical care for over 7 months.
And Senator Pate, can you talk about, I guess, the difference, or Mr. Neve, about how the government is treating men and women that are detained in northeastern Syria? We have seen women come back that have been charged with terrorism-related offenses. Can you just talk about why you think the government, from your perspective, is treating the men differently?
You've heard this several times from us. We wish we could answer that question because, again, it's an indefensible distinction, and the fact that there is no openness and transparency as to why, with respect to some Canadians, the government is prepared to turn to the Canadian legal system to deal with any concerns, whereas with other Canadian citizens who equally could be dealt with through that very same legal system, they seem absolutely to refuse to even entertain that possibility. It's discriminatory, it's deeply problematic, and the longer it goes on, the deeper the human rights consequences become. I think what has become so abundantly clear as a growing number of Canadian women have been returned, and in each instance, whether it be criminal charges or the use of peace bonds, the legal system has responded. The argument that somehow we can't deal with this in Canada has evaporated. It's become very clear that we have a number of options in the legal system, if necessary, and it's time for that to become at the fore of Canada's strategy here.
Thank you. Judy, do you have any questions?
I'd like the group to address the concerns from members of the Yazidi community that bringing back these individuals will re-traumatize this community. And, you know, we talk about the fact that no evidence has been presented in court as to whether or not these men, these Canadian women also have committed any type of crime. But at the same time, you know, there is an assumption, whether it's right or wrong, that the government, CSIS, RCMP, public security have some information as to how secure these individuals are. So how do you handle that in terms of what you would say to this Yazidi community who will be traumatized, who are traumatized by every story that comes out, because they do have these concerns that these detainees were involved in their treatment, their torture, when they were in Syria?
So my immediate response is, if there is evidence, the government has a responsibility to produce that. And then there are consequences for that evidence being brought forth, as Mr. Neve has already said. The reality is, it actually perpetuates that torture of the community by saying there may be information or insinuating there's information and then not allowing the due process to ensue, to have the evidence brought forward, to be tested, and to have it addressed. And I can certainly appreciate that for communities who may be being told one thing without any presentation of evidence to support that, would be traumatized. I think it's in the interest of both the individuals who are detained as well as the communities that are being traumatized to bring forth that evidence, have it tested, and go through the appropriate procedures here in Canada with the necessary legal protections for both those who are fearing victimization or who are feeling traumatized, as well as those who are being right now detained.
And if I could just add, I totally agree with the way Senator Pate has framed this, and I think we can look more widely to the fact that this challenge of whenever efforts are underway to ensure justice in the face of mass atrocities, as the Yazidi population has absolutely endured, whether it's at the International Criminal Court or other tribunals or through other kinds of legal proceedings that have started to explore how you do deliver justice in those contexts, it has become very clear that having trauma-informed, victim-supportive approaches to how you deliver justice in those contexts, number one, is absolutely vitally important, and number two, is possible. And that at the end of the day, therefore, justice of that quality becomes part of healing and recovery and minimizes and avoids, hopefully, re-traumatization. And then the backdrop to all of this is let's remember, Sally Lane's been told by the British police that there's no indication of her son of being responsible for any such wrongdoing. Justice Brown, in his ruling, made it clear that he was told in the proceedings by Canadian officials that they don't have evidence of that kind of wrongdoing on the part of these four men. Which I think takes us a bit to this kind of smoke and mirrors context that I think in the end of the day is in no one's interest. It's not in the interest of the Yazidi community, it's not in the interests of the four men, and it's not in the interest of justice.
Could I also add, there's over 400 Yazidis who are held in these horrific prison camps as well. Over 400. Canada is on record in Parliament and in the media as saying that they care. Why isn't Canada working to bring those 400 Yazidis here? And part of the trauma as well is that many in the Yazidi community have been separated for years from their loved ones because their applications for family reunification are sitting in the IRCC immigration bureaucracy. So I share the concern that they are traumatized, and part of the healing is at least Canada prioritizing their family reunification, A, and B, seeing what they can to do to get those 400 Yazidis who have nowhere else to go out of those camps, bring them to Canada as well.
Also to be a lot of this mission is dependent on AINS, dependent on the Syrian Defense Forces in terms of the Kurdish authorities, if they will allow access. So there must be concerns about that. I'm thinking about the fact that Canadian authorities, with the help of the U.S. Military, were unable to get 2 Canadian women and 3 children on a plane, and they were approved for the move. And last minute, they were unable to make it onto that plane. So I want to get a sense of how this delegation will go about ensuring that this is not a mission that is for naught, that something will come of it.
Well, I think, as we said earlier, our fundamental goal is the welfare side of things, and so as long as we are able to have access and to visit all or as many Canadians in the camps and detention centres as we can, to verify their welfare and see about their conditions, then it isn't for naught. And we are having those discussions with AINS officials now. We're not going to just show up unannounced. We're not going to show up just with our fingers crossed that we will be able to get that kind of access. We'll arrange it in advance so that we know that at least that side of the mission will have been fulfilled.
Have you been given any that the men that you want to see are alive. We hear that there has been no proof of life for several years in regards to these cases.
We do not yet have that. And that's obviously another key piece of what this is all about.
About previously before how frustrating it has been for you to watch the repatriation ceremonies when the signatures are signed between Canadian officials, because you know just how close they are to your son. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yes, every time any delegation goes for a handover ceremony to receive their citizens back to their home countries, there is this celebration in Kamishli, the main town in northeast Syria. Kamishli is where Jack is being held in a prison, and his prison is very, very close to where that handover ceremony takes place. And you know, yes, it's incredibly frustrating to know how easy it is. You know that not only access to Jack, but how easy it would be to repatriate him. The same officials would come up from the embassy in Lebanon. They fly to Kamishli. They sign the paperwork, and people go home. That could very easily happen for Jack. It's happened for the Canadian women, and as it stands now, Canadian women are receiving the justice that my son is being denied. For what reason? Because he's male. You know, the charter is for everyone. It's not just for children. It's not just for women. It's for everyone, and the same rules of justice apply to Jack as to everyone. And so we don't feel we're asking for very much. We're just asking for the Canadian government to fulfill its obligations and to stop human rights abuse and to allow a fair trial, allow Jack to be heard. I mean, I've been speaking for him for 9 years now with the knowledge that I have about him. And I've been trying to convince the authorities just to allow him to tell his side of the story. And that is what is being denied. And that is what I simply do not understand. I'm sorry.
Jim, do you have any other question? Oh, perfect. So that's all the question we had. That concludes the press conference. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
It's your being around that will help, that will assist this process, because as you well know, when they start to pivot the arguments between levels of court, you rightly ask the questions of on what basis are they making these decisions. So it started out, they were all dangerous, the evidence doesn't get produced. Now it's does the Canadian government have the legal obligation? It'll be interesting to see what their argument is at the Supreme Court of Canada.
It'll also be interesting to see what their response is to today's press conference. Will they? We have an open letter to Global Affairs Canada where we have said, can we meet with you? Members of the delegation meet with you, discuss our plans, make sure we're all on the same page, and get this done. If you're not willing to do it, we're willing to do it. Let's work together. We have yet to get a response from Global Affairs Canada, but maybe if they get questions from the media, that might help spur a response as well.